The stagecoach lurched one last time, a final groan of tortured wood and leather, before settling into a stillness that felt more absolute than any silence Eliza had known. For 8 days, the world had been a constant, churning misery of dust, sweat, and the percussive jolt of rock-strewn roads. Now, the quiet was a physical weight. Dust, the color of rust and bone, coated everything. Her worn calico dress, the frayed edges of her bonnet, her eyelashes. She could taste it on her tongue, a fine grit that seemed to have worked its way into her very soul. Through the grimy window, she saw Perdition Flats. It was less a town than a scar on the land, a handful of sun-bleached buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, merciless expanse of the desert that stretched in every direction. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, so bright it hurt to look at. A hot wind coiled through the single street, lifting dust devils that danced and died in an instant. Her hands, slick with nervous sweat, trembled as she clutched the letter in her lap. The paper was soft and worn thin along the creases, a holy relic she had read 1,000 times. Mr. Abernathy's words, penned in a neat, hopeful script, were all she had left. A new life. Eliza. A clean slate under God's wide sky, where a person is judged by their willingness to work, not by the whispers of the past. A clean slate. The thought was a prayer she had repeated until it had lost all meaning, a hollow echo in the empty chambers of her heart. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-cracked leather, threw open the door. End of the line. Miss Perdition Flats. Eliza gathered her small, battered satchel and stepped down, her legs unsteady. The heat hit her like a fist. The air was thick with the smells of baked earth, horse manure, and something else, something sour and vaguely threatening, like stale whiskey and despair. Men stopped what they were doing, their faces turning towards her. They were hard-looking men, their eyes narrowed against the sun's glare, their gazes lingering on her with a frank, assessing quality that made her skin crawl. She pulled her bonnet lower, her world shrinking to the scuffed toes of her boots against the powdery dirt. She was to meet Mr. Abernathy at the sheriff's office. He had written that the sheriff, a man named Potter, was a friend and would see her settled until he arrived from his claim. Clutching that thought like a shield, Eliza made her way toward the building with the faded, hand-painted sign. Sheriff Potter was a heavy man, his belly straining the buttons of his sweat-stained shirt. He sat behind a scarred wooden desk, a half-empty bottle at his elbow, and he did not stand when she entered. He listened to her introduction, his eyes small and flat in his fleshy face, and when she finished, he took a long, slow drink from a tin cup. "Abernathy," he said, his voice a low rumble. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You must be the woman he sent for." Relief, so sharp and sudden it was painful, flooded through her. "Yes, I am Eliza. Is he here?" The sheriff stared at her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her dusty clothes, the pale exhaustion of her face. He sighed, a weary, rattling sound. "He's here," he said, and gestured with his thumb toward the back of the office. "In a manner of speaking, Undertaker's got a room he uses." The relief inside her curdled into ice. I don't understand." "Not much to understand," Potter said, his tone devoid of pity. 2 nights ago, Jedediah Abernathy sat down for a game of poker at the saloon, accused a man of cheating. The other man accused him of the same. Guns were drawn. Jedediah was slower. He took another drink. Buried him yesterday morning. The room tilted. The buzzing of a fly trapped against the window pane grew to a deafening roar in her ears. She gripped the edge of the desk to keep from falling, the worn paper of the letter crinkling in her fist. It could not be. It was some terrible mistake. God could not be so cruel. "No," she whispered, the word a dry rasp in her throat. He promised a new life." "Well, miss," the sheriff said, pushing his chair back. "Looks like you got here just in time for his new one." He finally stood, the wood groaning in protest. "I'm sorry for your trouble, but he left nothing behind. Lost his claim in that same poker game. Whatever money he had on him was gone by the time I got there. There's nothing for you here. Nothing." The word was a chasm opening at her feet. She was penniless, friendless, 1,000 miles from a home that had cast her out. She was adrift in this terrible, sun-scorched place, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a shame so profound it felt like a second skin. The sheriff saw the panic in her eyes, and his face hardened. "Look, miss, I can't help you. My advice is to take the next stagecoach out of here. It leaves in 2 days." "I have no money for passage," she said, her voice trembling. He shrugged. "That's not my concern." She left the office in a daze, stumbling back into the oppressive heat of the street. The stares of the men felt different now, sharper, tinged with a predatory curiosity. She was no longer a prospective bride, a respectable woman under a man's protection. She was unattached, alone, available. A tall, rangy man with cruel eyes and a tobacco-stained smile detached himself from a group leaning against the general store. He stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Well now," he drawled, looking her up and down. "Heard about your bad luck, little lady. A real shame. A pretty thing like you, all alone." His friend snickered behind him. Eliza tried to step around him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Excuse me, sir." He moved with her, a smirk playing on his lips. "No need to be in such a hurry. Name's Silas. Maybe I can help you. Forget your troubles." He reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm. His grip was like iron. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through her shock. "Let go of me." "Now, don't be like that," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A girl like you needs a man to look out for her in a town like this. I could look out for you real good." It was then that another voice cut through the air, low and cold as a winter wind. "She told you to let her go." The voice came from a man who had been sitting in the shade of the saloon's covered porch, a man she had not noticed before. He rose slowly, unfolding himself from his chair. He was tall and lean, dressed in dusty, trail-worn clothes. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that looked as if it had been carved from the unforgiving rock of the surrounding mesas. His eyes, when he lifted his head, were the color of slate and held a stillness that was more menacing than any open threat. Silas's hand tightened on her arm, but his confidence wavered. "This ain't your concern. Kane." The man, Kane, took a step forward. He did not hurry. He did not raise his voice. He simply moved into the center of the street, his presence radiating a quiet, lethal authority. "You've got 2 seconds to take your hand off her before I take it off you." There was no bluster in his tone, only the flat certainty of a promise. Silas looked from Kane's dead-still eyes to the worn Colt holstered on his hip. A flicker of fear, or perhaps just good sense, crossed his face. With a muttered curse, he released Eliza's arm and backed away, rejoining his friends with a nervous bravado that fooled no one. Eliza stood frozen, rubbing her arm where Silas's fingers had dug into her flesh. She looked at the man who had intervened. His face was all sharp angles and sun-browned skin, marked by a faint, white scar that cut through one eyebrow. He wasn't handsome in the way Mr. Abernathy had been, with his soft hands and gentle smile. This man was hard, weathered, dangerous. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment she felt as though he could see right through her, down to the secret, shameful girl she kept hidden from the world. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over her once more before he turned without another word and disappeared into the shadows of the saloon. Eliza's attempt to leave town was as futile as she had feared. Sheriff Potter was blunt. "The road east is crawling with outlaws. Apaches, too. A woman traveling alone is just asking for a grave without a marker. You stay put until the stage comes through." He offered no solution for how she was to survive until then. Her desperation led her to the town's only boarding house, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, run by a gaunt, severe-looking widow named Martha Gable. Mrs. Gable listened to her story with pursed lips and unsympathetic eyes. "I have no money for a room," Eliza admitted, her voice thick with humiliation. "But I am a hard worker. I can cook, clean, sew, anything you need." Mrs. Gable considered her for a long, silent moment. "Dead man's intended, eh? Tsk. A bad business." She finally sighed. "I need someone to clean the rooms and help in the kitchen. The pay is a bed in the attic and 2 meals a day, and you'll keep to yourself. I won't have any trouble in my establishment." The way she said the word trouble made it clear she was talking about Eliza herself. The attic room was small, hot, and suffocating. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall beneath a single, grimy window that looked out over the dusty street. It was there, in the oppressive silence of that first night, that the full weight of her past came crashing down on her. She had not just fled poverty, she had fled disgrace. She closed her eyes and saw it all again. The cold, stone floor of the church vestry, the slick sweat of pain, the thin, weak cry of a baby born in secret and shame. A little girl, Sarah. She had lived for 6 days, 6 days of frantic, hidden love and terror, and then a fever had stolen her away, her small body still and silent in Eliza's arms. Her family, devout and unforgiving, had learned her secret. Her father had called her a harlot and cast her out. Her mother had turned her face away. The mail-order marriage to Mr. Abernathy had been her one, desperate chance to outrun the ghost of that tiny, unmarked grave, to become someone else, someone new and clean. And now that chance was gone, buried in the same unforgiving dirt. The whispers she had fled in Pennsylvania had followed her here, to Perdition Flats. Only now they were louder. The women of the town watched her with cold suspicion when she went to the well. They would stop talking as she approached, their conversations resuming in hushed, venomous tones as soon as she had passed. She was the outsider, the woman of ill repute who had come to town for a man now dead, a woman who now worked for her keep in a boarding house full of men. Their assumptions were a brand on her skin. She saw the man, Gideon Kane, a few times in the days that followed. He never spoke to her, but she would feel his eyes on her. Once, she saw him across the street, leaning against a post as he conducted some business over a stack of cattle hides. He was not staring, not in the leering way of men like Silas. It was a watchful, distant gaze, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. The intensity of it was unsettling. Yet she did not feel threatened. She felt seen. One evening, unable to bear the heat of her attic room, she stepped outside into the cooler air. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange, red, and purple. The raw, desolate beauty of it was breathtaking. She saw a figure standing alone at the edge of town, a silhouette against the dying light. It was Gideon Kane. He was staring out at the red mesas on the horizon, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. She was about to turn back inside when she heard him murmur something to the empty air. His voice was low and rough, carried on the wind. "The dead don't stay buried out here, they just get thirsty." The words sent a chill down her spine. He spoke as if he knew them intimately. The thirsty dead. He seemed a man haunted, not by spirits, but by memory. For the first time, she felt a strange kinship with this cold, silent man. They were both tethered to their ghosts. The true terror came 2 nights later. A late-running poker game in the saloon downstairs had ended, and the boarding house was filled with the sounds of drunken men stumbling to their rooms. Eliza lay on her cot, her door bolted, listening to the heavy footsteps and coarse laughter. Then, she heard a fumbling at her own door. Her blood ran cold. "Little bird," a slurred voice called from the other side. "I know you're in there. Old Silas just wants to be friendly." The handle rattled violently. She scrambled off the cot, pressing herself into the far corner of the room. Her hand clapped over her mouth to stifle a scream. The wood of the door splintered as a heavy shoulder slammed against it. Once, twice. On the third impact, the bolt gave way and the door flew open. Silas stood there, swaying, his face flushed with drink and ugly intent. A predatory grin spread across his face as his eyes found her in the moonlight. "There you are." He took a shuffling step into the room, and Eliza knew, with a certainty that stole her breath, that no one would help her. She was the fallen woman, the outsider. Whatever happened to her would be her own fault. But as Silas lunged for her, a dark shape filled the doorway behind him. It was Gideon Kane. He moved with a swift, silent deadliness that was terrifying to behold. He did not speak. He simply grabbed Silas by the collar, spun him around, and slammed him against the wall of the corridor. The sound was a sickening thud of bone and plaster. Silas grunted, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Gideon leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper that Eliza could not hear but whose effect was immediate. Silas's face went pale. He nodded frantically, and when Gideon released him, he all but fell down the stairs in his haste to escape. Gideon stood in the corridor for a long moment, his back to her, his chest rising and falling. He turned his head slowly and looked at her, huddled in the corner, shaking uncontrollably. His slate-gray eyes held a flicker of something she could not name. Pity, anger, perhaps even a shared understanding of pain. He stepped back, pulling her broken door closed as best he could. He did not leave. She heard a soft thud, and when she crept to the door and peered through the splintered frame, she saw him. He had settled on the floor, his back against the opposite wall. His hat tipped low over his eyes and his arms crossed over his chest. He was guarding her door. He stayed there all night, a silent, solitary sentinel. And for the first time since she had arrived in this God-forsaken town, Eliza slept without fear. They began to speak after that, in quiet, hesitant fragments. He would be there in the early morning when she came down to start her chores, nursing a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. "You slept all right?" he asked one morning, his voice still rough. "Yes, thank you," she replied, her own voice soft. He just nodded. Another day, she found him mending a piece of tack on the porch. She brought him a dipper of cool water from the well. He took it without a word, but his eyes met hers over the rim, and she saw the exhaustion etched around them. Slowly, painfully, pieces of their stories emerged. He told her he ran a small cattle operation a few miles out of town, that he only came in for supplies. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, as if the words themselves were a burden. One evening, as a cool breeze finally offered respite from the day's heat, they found themselves sitting on the edge of the porch, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. "You watch the road a lot," he observed, not looking at her. "Like you're still expecting someone." "I suppose I am," she admitted quietly. "Or I was. It's a hard habit to break." "Hope." He was silent for a long time. "Hope's a dangerous thing to have out here." "What is there without it?" she asked. He finally turned to look at her, and in the dim light, the hardness in his face seemed to soften, replaced by a profound, bottomless grief. "I had a wife once," he said, his voice so low she had to lean in to hear it. "And a little boy. We had a small ranch, down near the border. I was gone, moving stock. Comancheros came through. They burned everything." He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on some distant, terrible memory. "When I got back, there was nothing left to bury. I wasn't there. I should have been there." The raw agony in his voice was a physical thing, a wound that had never healed. Eliza felt her own sorrow rise to meet his. Two broken people, sitting in the twilight, haunted by the ghosts of children. She wanted to reach out, to place her hand on his, but she did not dare. Their connection was too new, too fragile, a tentative bridge across a chasm of private pain. But she knew, in that moment, that he was the only person in this entire town who could possibly understand the weight she carried. He seemed to feel it too. The air between them grew charged, thick with unspoken things. He looked at her, his eyes tracing the line of her face in the starlight, and she saw a flicker of yearning there, a desperate loneliness that mirrored her own. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the hard mask she knew so well. He stood up abruptly. "You should stay away from me, Eliza," he said, his voice once again cold and distant. "I'm no good for a woman like you. I bring nothing but trouble." He turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving her alone on the porch with the echo of his warning and the sudden, aching certainty that it was already too late. Life in Perdition Flats settled into a harsh, grinding rhythm. Eliza learned the geography of her small world, the back-breaking labor of the boarding house, the brief, scorching walk to the general store, the tense, silent trips to the communal well. She learned to keep her eyes downcast, to make her body small and unassuming, to become a ghost in a town that had already decided who she was. She was adjusting not to a new life, but to a new kind of survival, one measured in her ability to remain invisible. But invisibility was a luxury she was not afforded. Her presence was a stone thrown into the stagnant pool of the town's social order, and the ripples of gossip were constant and cruel. She was the dead man's mail-order bride, a woman of questionable origins now living unchaperoned in a house full of rough men. The narrative wrote itself in the minds of the townspeople, and it was an ugly one. The whispers found their voice one blistering afternoon at the well. Eliza was waiting her turn, the wooden buckets heavy in her hands, the sun a hammer against the back of her neck. Two women stood ahead of her, their heads close together, their bonnets like shields. One of them, a woman named Agnes with a face like sour milk, turned and looked directly at Eliza, her eyes filled with a righteous contempt. "Some have no shame," Agnes said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Coming here for a man's money. When he turns up dead, they just stay on, waiting for the next one." She spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust near Eliza's feet. "Nothing more than the dead man's whore." The words struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow. The heat drained from her face, replaced by an icy coldness that spread through her limbs. She could feel the eyes of the other women on her, some smug, some merely curious. No one defended her. No one spoke a word. She was utterly alone, branded and condemned in the public square. She filled her buckets, her hands trembling so badly she slopped water onto her dress, and walked away without meeting a single gaze. The insult clung to her like the dust, a foul film she could not wash away. The town's judgment soon found a more powerful champion. Reverend Miller was a traveling preacher who passed through Perdition Flats every few months. A thin, fervent man with fire and brimstone eyes and a voice that could curdle milk. He saw sin in every shadow, and in Eliza, he found a sermon waiting to be preached. He cornered her one afternoon as she was sweeping the boarding house porch. He did not block her path or raise his voice. He simply stood before her, his Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon, and began to speak, his voice ringing with sanctimonious authority. "The soul of this town is in peril," he declared, his gaze fixed on her, though his words were meant for the men lounging at the saloon across the street and the women who had paused on their errands. "We allow wickedness to fester in our midst. We harbor a fallen woman, an unmarried woman living under a roof with men of low character, a Jezebel who tempts the righteous with her very presence." Eliza froze, the broom clutched in her hands. A small crowd was gathering. She felt 100 eyes on her, stripping her bare. Her cheeks burned with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. "She is a vagrant in the eyes of the Lord," the preacher thundered, pointing a long, bony finger at her. A woman without the protection of a husband or a father is an invitation to sin. She must repent her wicked ways or be cast out, lest her corruption spread like a plague among us." Through the haze of her humiliation, she saw Gideon. He had been coming out of the general store, a burlap sack over his shoulder. He stopped dead when he saw the scene, his body going rigid. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood there, his face a mask of stone, and stared at the preacher. The force of his gaze was palpable, a silent, deadly counterpoint to the preacher's holy rage. The preacher faltered for a moment, his words catching in his throat under the weight of that unblinking stare, before he recovered and continued his tirade. But Eliza had seen something else in Gideon's face in that brief moment. Beneath the cold anger, she saw a flicker of his own shame. It was a deep, gut-wrenching shame that seemed to coil in on itself. He was ashamed of the preacher, of the town, of this ugly, public stripping of her dignity. But as she watched him, she felt a terrible, mistaken certainty settle in her heart. He was ashamed of her, ashamed to be associated with her, ashamed that his small acts of kindness had linked his name to that of the town's fallen woman. The thought was a fresh wound on top of all the others. She turned, dropped the broom, and fled into the dark anonymity of the boarding house, pulling back from the one person who had shown her any decency. For days, she avoided him. When she saw him approaching, she would cross the street or duck into a shop. When he sat at the kitchen table in the morning, she would make herself busy in the pantry until he was gone. The fragile connection they had built seemed to shatter. The silence between them now filled with the preacher's ugly accusations. Then the sandstorm came. It began as a yellow haze on the horizon, a smudge of color against the pale sky. Within an hour, the world was blotted out. The wind howled like a banshee, driving a relentless, stinging tide of sand that found its way through every crack and crevice. The town shuttered itself down, the streets deserted, the world reduced to the groaning of wood and the ceaseless shriek of the wind. Eliza was securing the shutters on the boarding house windows when she saw a light in the livery stable across the street. A single lantern, its flame a small, defiant beacon in the swirling chaos. Through the maelstrom of dust, she could just make out a figure moving inside. It was Gideon, drawn by an instinct she did not understand. She pulled her shawl tight over her head and face and ran across the street, leaning into the wind that threatened to tear her from her feet. The air was thick with grit. She could barely breathe. She stumbled into the relative calm of the stable, blinking the dust from her eyes. The vast, barn-like space was filled with the dancing shadows cast by the lantern. Gideon was there, his back to her, kneeling beside his horse. The animal was distressed, shifting its weight and snorting nervously. As Eliza drew closer, she saw the dark, ugly gash on its hind leg, a long tear that was still oozing blood. "What happened?" she asked, her voice raspy from the dust. He started, not having heard her approach over the storm. He looked up, his face grim in the lantern light. Caught himself on a piece of loose wire in the corral when the storm spooked him. He gestured to the wound with a blood-stained cloth. "It's deep, needs stitching." He worked with a grim focus, his movements sure and economical. But it was difficult work for one man. The horse, frightened and in pain, kept trying to pull away. "Let me help," she said, stepping forward. "I can hold his head, keep him calm." Gideon hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting hers. The preacher's words hung in the air between them. Then he gave a curt nod. "All right." She moved to the horse's head, stroking its neck, murmuring soft, soothing words into its ear. The animal was still nervous, its eyes wide, but it slowly began to quiet under her gentle touch. Gideon worked by her side, cleaning the wound, his hands surprisingly steady as he threaded a curved needle. They worked in silence, the only sounds the howl of the wind outside, the soft snorts of the horse, and the quiet sounds of their own breathing. The small circle of lantern light created an intimate world, shutting out the storm and the town and all its venomous whispers. They were just two people, working together to soothe a creature's pain. The physical closeness was unnerving. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of leather, sweat and clean blood on his skin. When he reached for a clean cloth, his arm brushed against hers, and a jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot through her. She saw his jaw tighten. When the last stitch was in place, he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "He'll be all right," she said, still stroking the horse's neck. "He's tough," Gideon replied, his eyes on the animal, but his words seemed to hold a different meaning. He leaned against a support beam, the weariness he usually held at bay settling over him like a shroud. The storm had trapped them, broken the silence between them, and now something else was breaking open. "I wasn't just moving stock," he said suddenly, his voice rough with an old pain. He was staring into the swirling dust outside the stable door, but she knew he was seeing something else entirely. "The day my family was killed, I wasn't just away on business. I was in Mexico, riding with a band of hired guns. We were chasing bandits for a bounty." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a self-loathing so profound it made her ache. "I was chasing another man's ghosts while my own home burned. I chose blood money over them. When I got back, I found what was left. I buried them with my own hands. What the fire and the raiders hadn't taken." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. This was the source of his shame, the secret wound he carried. His grief was tangled with a guilt so deep he was drowning in it. Eliza felt her own secret rise in her throat, a truth just as painful, just as buried. She owed him her own story, her own brokenness. "There was a church," she began, her voice a near whisper. "Back home, that's where my baby was born, on the cold stone floor of the vestry, in the middle of the night." She looked down at her hands, seeing them stained with a different kind of blood. "I bled from childbirth alone in a church, and no one came to help me. I prayed, and no one answered." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She lived for 6 days. Then she was gone. My family said it was God's punishment." They stared at each other across the lantern light, two souls stripped bare, their ugliest scars exposed. He saw her shame, and she saw his, and in that shared darkness, there was no judgment. There was only a terrible, aching recognition. He moved toward her slowly, as if pulled by a force he could not resist. He stopped just before her, his tall frame blocking out the rest of the world. He raised a hand, his fingers calloused and rough, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her dusty cheek. His touch was tentative, questioning. Her breath hitched in her throat. Then he leaned in, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of shared grief and unbearable loneliness. It was the collision of two people who had thought themselves forever lost. For a breathtaking moment, she leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, anchoring herself to this one solid thing in a world of chaos. And then, just as suddenly, he pulled back. He tore himself away from her as if he had been burned, his face a mask of anger and self-disgust. He took a staggering step back, running a hand through his hair. "No!" he rasped, his voice harsh. He wouldn't look at her. "Desire is a dangerous thing. Eliza, it makes a man forget what he is." He finally met her eyes, and they were cold as slate again. The walls slammed back into place. "You don't want a man like me." He turned and strode to the far side of the stable, leaving her trembling in the lantern light, the ghost of his touch still burning on her lips. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. The peace was shattered when Mrs. Gable summoned Eliza to the kitchen, her face a mixture of grim satisfaction and pity. "Sheriff Potter was just here," she said, not meeting Eliza's eyes. "He says the county to the east has a poorhouse. They're willing to take you in." He's made arrangements. Says you're officially a vagrant now. He's sending you on the next supply wagon. It leaves tomorrow morning. The word was a branding iron. Vagrant. A public burden. A piece of human refuse to be disposed of. She was being cast out, just as her father had cast her out, just as the preacher had demanded. Panic, cold and suffocating, seized her. She thought of Gideon, of his warning, of the way he had pulled away from her. He had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her. She had nowhere to turn. She was in her attic room, numbly folding her few belongings, when she heard a commotion in the street below. She looked out the grimy window and saw Gideon's horse tied in front of the sheriff's office. A moment later, Gideon himself stormed out, his face like a thundercloud. He was followed by Sheriff Potter, who was gesturing angrily. Their voices were too low to hear, but the confrontation was plain to see. Then Gideon's voice rose, clear and sharp with a cold fury that cut through the air. "You will not put her on that wagon. She is not a vagrant, and she is not your problem to solve." "The hell she ain't," the sheriff shot back. "She's got no people, no money. What do you suggest I do with her, Kane?" Gideon took a step toward the sheriff, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt, a gesture that was both casual and deadly. "That's my business, but if you try to force her out of this town, I swear to you, Potter, I'll take her with me instead. And you don't want to know where that road leads." The sheriff blanched, taking an involuntary step back. He knew Gideon's reputation. He knew the threat was not an empty one. After a tense, silent standoff, Potter threw his hands up in defeat and retreated back into his office, slamming the door behind him. Gideon stood alone in the street for a long moment, his shoulders rigid. He looked up, his eyes finding her small window, and their gazes locked for a heartbeat. There was a wild, desperate look in his eyes that both thrilled and terrified her. Then he turned, untied his horse, and mounted in one fluid motion. He spurred the animal into a gallop and rode out of town, disappearing into the vast, shimmering heat of the desert, a solitary figure swallowed by the horizon. Eliza watched him go, her hand pressed against the window pane, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had defended her. He had claimed her. And in doing so, he had tied their fates together with a knot she did not know how to untangle. She watched the dust settle in the empty street, overcome by a terrifying, exhilarating fear of what she was starting to feel for the man who had just ridden away. Gideon's departure left a void in the town, a vacuum of quiet intensity that was soon filled by a different, more malevolent presence. He rode in 3 days later, a thick-set man on a powerful bay horse, moving with the unhurried confidence of a predator. He wore a dusty coat despite the heat, and a star was pinned to his vest, though it looked more like a trophy than a badge of honor. He had a wet, predatory smile and eyes like polished river stones, cold and smooth and ancient. He took a room at the boarding house and introduced himself to anyone who would listen as Burke, a tracker of men. He made his inquiries in the saloon, buying rounds of whiskey and letting the liquor loosen the tongues of the locals. Eliza, serving meals from the kitchen, could not help but overhear his questions. He was looking for a man, a tall man, quiet, good with a gun, a man with a scar through his right eyebrow. The description hit Eliza with the force of a physical blow. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, seized her. Burke's voice was casual, but his questions were like a net being drawn tighter and tighter. "They say he was part of a company down in Mexico a few years back," Burke said to a table of cowhands, his voice carrying easily through the room. "A company that broke bad. This man I'm looking for, he's wanted for the murder of his captain. Shot him in the back. They say..." Murder. The word was a serpent in the air. Eliza's hand trembled, and a plate clattered against a tray. Burke's cold eyes swiveled in her direction, a flicker of interest in their depths. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had noticed her reaction. She had seen the other scars on Gideon, faded, silvery lines on his arms and chest when his shirt was unbuttoned against the heat. She had never asked about them. She had been afraid to. Now, that fear had a name, and it was Burke. Panic was a wild animal clawing at her throat. She had to warn him. She had to know the truth. That night, when the town was shrouded in a moonless dark, she did something she never would have thought herself capable of. She crept out to the stable, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Mrs. Gable kept a placid old mare for errands. With shaking hands, Eliza saddled the horse, her mind screaming at her own audacity. This was stealing. This was a crime. But the thought of Gideon facing Burke alone was a far greater terror. She rode out of town, following the trail he had taken into the desert. The landscape, so menacing by day, was transformed by the night into a silent, cathedral-like world of silver and shadow. The air was cool and clean, and for the first time since arriving, Eliza felt she could breathe. She was riding away from the suffocating judgment of the town and toward a man who, whatever his past, had been the only one to see her as a person. She found his camp near dawn. He had made a life for himself in the shadow of a great, crumbling ruin, an old Spanish mission, its adobe walls melting back into the earth, the ghost of a bell tower reaching like a skeletal hand toward the sky. A small fire smoldered near a lean-to shelter. His horse, the one she had helped him tend, nickered softly as she approached. Gideon was awake instantly. He rose from his bedroll in one swift, silent motion, the gun in his hand before his eyes had fully registered who she was. When he saw her, the tension in his body eased, replaced by a deep, weary confusion.
"Eliza, what in God's name are you doing out here?"
She slid from the mare, her legs weak and trembling. "There's a man in town," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "His name is Burke. He's a bounty hunter. He's looking for a man who matches your description. He says the man is wanted for murder." Gideon did not flinch. He did not deny it. He simply stood there, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his hard face, and the silence that stretched between them was his confession. The hope she had carried with her on that desperate ride withered and died. He finally spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion.
"You should have stayed away. I told you I was trouble."
"I want to hear it from you," she insisted, her voice shaking. "The truth." He looked away from her, toward the ruins that loomed in the pre-dawn gloom. "Come on," he said, his tone flat. He led her through a crumbling archway into what had once been the mission's chapel. The roof was gone, open to the star-dusted sky, and the wind whispered through the empty alcoves where saints had once stood. It was a broken, holy place. He sat on the collapsed stones of the altar and finally told her the truth. "The man Burke is talking about, his name was Calloway. He was my captain, the leader of the company I rode with." His voice was a harsh rasp, the words torn from a place deep inside him. "He was a man with the devil's own smile. He could talk you into anything. We were supposed to be bringing order, chasing bandits, but the money was too good. The power, it corrupted him. It corrupted all of us." He paused, swallowing hard. "The raid on my ranch, it wasn't Comancheros. It was Calloway and his men, my wife. She had recognized one of them from a nearby town. She could have identified them. So they silenced her. They burned everything to cover their tracks. They had turned mercenary, selling their guns to anyone who would pay, wiping out anyone who got in their way." Eliza sank to her knees in the dust before him, her hands clasped together. The horror of it was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. "I found out a month later," Gideon continued, his eyes vacant, lost in the memory. "One of the younger men in the company got drunk and confessed. He couldn't live with it. Calloway had him killed the next day, said he was a deserter. I knew he'd taken everything from me. I hunted him for 6 months, found him in a cantina in Sonora." He finally looked at Eliza, and his eyes were hollowed out by a pain so profound it was almost black. "Burke is right. I killed him. I didn't shoot him in the back. I faced him, but I killed him just the same. I sent him to hell myself." He finished, and the silence that followed was absolute. He expected her to recoil, to run. He expected to see disgust and fear in her eyes. Instead, he saw only a deep, bottomless well of sorrow that mirrored his own. Eliza didn't run. She moved closer, kneeling between his legs on the dusty floor of the ruined chapel. She reached out with both hands and placed them flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of it beneath her palms. This was not the mark of a cold-blooded murderer. It was the brand of a man who had lost his soul and was still trying to find it. The violence he had committed was born not of evil, but of an agony so immense she could barely comprehend it. His breath shuddered out of him, a ragged, broken sound. He looked down at her hands on his chest as if they were a lifeline. Slowly, he covered her hands with his own, his large, calloused grip enclosing hers. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the ruins. Two broken people holding each other together as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern sky. What happened next was not a decision. It was an inevitability, as natural and as unstoppable as the rising sun. He leaned forward, and she met him halfway. The night that followed was not one of passion, but of a quiet, desperate communion. In the shelter of the crumbling adobe walls, they spoke a language of touch, of whispers that were not words but prayers, of long, searching looks that broke open the last of their defenses. It was a slow, aching discovery of two bodies and two souls who had thought themselves beyond the reach of comfort or grace. For one night, in the heart of the desert, they were not the cowboy haunted by ghosts and the fallen woman shamed by her past. They were just a man and a woman, finding a fragile sanctuary in each other's arms. At dawn, they lay tangled together under his single, rough blanket, watching the light paint the canyon walls in strokes of rose and gold. The world felt new and terrifyingly fragile. They were afraid of what the full light of day would bring, of what the world would do if it saw them like this, their defenses down, their hearts exposed. Gideon turned to her, his face soft in the early light. He traced the line of her jaw with one finger. His eyes filled with a kind of wondering awe, as if he were seeing her and himself for the very first time. "I've been waiting so long," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I thought love was dead in me." Eliza smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She placed her hand over his, pressing it to her cheek. "It wasn't dead," she replied softly, "just buried." The peace of their sanctuary could not last. They knew they had to face Burke. They rode back to Perdition Flats together, the old mare trailing behind Gideon's horse. The town felt different now, the stares of the people no longer just a source of shame, but a threat to this new, precious thing they had found. They learned the extent of the threat as soon as they entered the saloon. Burke was at the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand, holding court. He had spent the last day spreading a new poison. "And I find her horse gone this morning," he was saying, his voice laced with insinuation. "Ran off into the desert in the middle of the night. Now, where would a respectable woman run to? Unless, of course, she was running to her man, the murderer." He took a slow drink, his cold eyes landing on them as they stood in the doorway. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Seems to me the dead man's whore has found herself a new protector." Rage, white-hot and pure, surged through Eliza. All her life, she had borne the insults, the shame, the judgment. She had bowed her head and accepted her lot as a fallen woman. But not this, not now. She would not let this man defile what she and Gideon had shared. Before Gideon could move, she stepped forward, her back straight, her eyes blazing. She walked directly to the bar and stood before Burke, her small frame radiating a fury that made the larger man blink in surprise. "You will not call me that name," she said, her voice low and steady, but shaking with suppressed rage. "You know nothing of me, and you know nothing of him." Burke laughed, a short, ugly sound. I know he's a killer with a price on his head, and I know you spent the night with him. That's all I need to know. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like talons. You're coming with me. You're a witness. Gideon moved then. He crossed the room in 2 long, silent strides.
Get your hand off her,
he said, his voice deadly quiet. Burke released Eliza and turned to face Gideon, his smile widening. This was what he had wanted. Cain, I knew you'd come crawling back. You've got a choice. You can come with me peacefully, or I can drag your corpse back.
That's not one of your choices,
Gideon said. The fight exploded with a primal, terrifying speed. It was not a brawl. It was an attempt at murder. Burke drew a knife, a long, wicked-looking blade that flashed in the dim light. Gideon met him with nothing but his fists. The sound was a wet, sickening crack as Gideon's knuckles connected with Burke's jaw. They crashed over a table, sending cards and glasses flying. It was brutal and ugly. Burke was bigger, but Gideon was faster, fueled by a cold, desperate rage. The men in the saloon backed away, some shouting encouragement, others just watching with wide, hungry eyes. Eliza stood frozen for a second, horrified. Then, a survival instinct took over. She saw a rifle leaning against the wall behind the bar. She scrambled over, her hands closing around the heavy wood and cool steel. She didn't know how to shoot, but she had seen men handle these weapons her whole life. She lifted the heavy barrel, cocked the hammer, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The rifle kicked back hard, slamming into her shoulder and sending a shock of pain through her. But it had the desired effect. The blast of noise and the smell of gunpowder shocked everyone into stillness. Gideon and Burke froze, tangled together on the floor, their faces streaked with blood and sweat. The door to the saloon burst open and Sheriff Potter stood there, his own gun drawn, his face flushed and angry. He took in the scene, the 2 bloodied men on the floor, the terrified patrons, and Eliza standing behind the bar, shaking, a smoking rifle in her hands. His eyes finally settled on Gideon. He had seen enough. The violence, the blood, the constant disruption. He pointed a fat, trembling finger at him. Cain, he yelled, his voice cracking. I've had enough of you and your trouble. I want you out of my town. Be gone by nightfall. Or so help me. I'll lock you up and let this man take you, dead or alive. I don't care which. There was no choice to be made. As Gideon walked out of the saloon, his lips split and a dark bruise already forming high on his cheekbone. Eliza simply followed him. She did not go back to the boarding house for her meager belongings, the worn calico dress on her back, the sturdy boots on her feet, the memory of a dead man's promise and the ghost of a dead child. That was all she owned in the world, and it was all she would take with her. Everything else, the whispers and the scorn, the suffocating heat of her attic room, she was glad to leave behind. He went to the livery stable without a word, moving with the stiff, painful grace of a man whose body was a map of fresh aches. He saddled his horse, his movements economical and practiced. He did not look at her, but he knew she was there. When he was done, he turned to the old mare she had ridden from his camp. He checked the cinch, adjusted the bridle, and then he looked at her, his slate-gray eyes asking the question he would not speak aloud. I'm going with you, she said, her voice quiet but firm, a small, steady flame in the wreckage of the day. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He looked from her face to the single dusty street of Perdition Flats, a town that had offered her nothing but grief and condemnation. He gave a single, curt nod. That was all. There were no promises, no words of comfort. There was only the shared understanding that whatever lay ahead in the vast, merciless desert, it had to be better than what they were leaving behind. They rode out of town as the sun began its long, slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and blood. The people of Perdition Flats watched them go. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped on the saloon porch, their drinks held halfway to their lips. Eliza could feel their stares like a physical weight on her back, a final volley of judgment. She did not look back. She fixed her eyes on the endless horizon, on the silhouette of Gideon riding just ahead of her, and for the first time, she felt not like she was running from her past, but riding toward a future. The desert swallowed them whole. The last vestiges of the town disappeared behind a low rise, and they were utterly alone in a world of stone, sand, and sky. The first days were a trial by silence. The easy communion they had found in the ruined chapel was gone, burned away by the violence in the saloon and the uncertainty of their flight. A heavy quiet settled between them, thick with all the things they did not know how to say. They were two strangers, bound together by desperation and a fragile, unnamed tenderness. They survived. That was the only word for it. They survived the relentless heat that beat down from a white-hot sky. The nights that grew so cold their bones ached. The gnawing thirst that was a constant companion. Gideon was a creature of this harsh landscape. He moved through it with a quiet competence that bordered on reverence. He taught her, not with words, but with actions. He showed her how to find water, a seep of moisture at the base of a rock wall that she would have walked past without a second glance. He showed her which plants were edible, their roots holding a bitter, life-sustaining liquid. He taught her how to read the tracks in the sand, to know what creatures had passed and when. Eliza, in turn, found her own ways to care for him. In the evenings, when they made their spare camps in the shelter of a rocky overhang, she would tend to the cuts and bruises he had earned in his fight with Burke. She would clean the wounds with precious water and a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. He would sit stiffly, his jaw tight, enduring her touch as if it were a different kind of pain. These small, silent rituals became their new language, a shared cup of water, a piece of dried meat passed from his hand to hers, the simple act of sitting together and watching the stars ignite in the vast, black sky. These were the threads from which they began to weave a fragile trust. They traveled deeper into the wilderness, into a labyrinth of canyons where the world was carved from red rock. The cliffs rose on either side of them like the walls of ancient cathedrals, silent and immense. The sun struck their tops, setting them ablaze with color, while the canyon floors remained in a cool, purple shadow. Here, the silence was different. It was not empty, but full of a deep, resonant peace. The world felt older, purer, a place untouched by the petty cruelties of men like Burke or the judging eyes of towns like Perdition Flats. In the evenings, the sky was a revelation. With no town lights to dim them, the stars burned with a fierce, cold fire. They were not distant, gentle sparks, but blazing embers that seemed close enough to touch. They would lie on their bedrolls, a small fire crackling between them, and stare up at the river of light that was the Milky Way. "I've never seen so many," she whispered one night, the words a soft disturbance in the immense quiet. Gideon was lying on his back, his hat covering his face. "Out here, there's nothing to get in the way," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You see things as they really are." He was not just talking about the stars. They were beginning to see each other, too. The hard shell he wore like armor was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the grieving man beneath. The fear that had kept her small and silent was giving way to a quiet resilience she had never known she possessed. She was no longer just the fallen woman. She was a survivor. But the desert was a fickle sanctuary. It could give peace with one hand and take everything with the other. One afternoon, the air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange, metallic tang. The sky to the west turned a bruised, greenish black. The clouds roiled and boiled, and in the distance, a flicker of jagged, violet light silently split the sky. "We need to find shelter," Gideon said, his voice tight with an urgency she had not heard before. "Now." The wind picked up, cool at first, then hot and dry, carrying the scent of ozone and something else, the smell of smoke. Eliza looked to the south and saw it, a low, angry orange glow on the horizon, pulsing like a malevolent heart. The lightning had found its mark, a brush fire. They urged their horses on, moving deeper into the canyon, searching for a place to wait out the twin threats of the coming storm and the advancing fire. The wind was a roaring beast now, whipping sand and grit into their faces. The sky was a terrifying spectacle of light and shadow. The fire was moving with an incredible speed, a wall of flame devouring the dry brush and scrub pine in its path. They found it by sheer luck, a dark slash in the rock face, the mouth of a shallow cave, partially hidden by a fall of boulders. It was not much, but it was shelter. Gideon led the horses inside, their eyes wide with fear, and Eliza followed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They huddled together at the mouth of the cave, watching the apocalypse unfold. The lightning walked across the canyon rims, each strike followed by a deafening crack of thunder that echoed off the rock walls. The fire raged on the plains below, a sea of churning flame that lit the roiling clouds from beneath. The world was smoke and ash and fire. The heat was intense, even from a distance. Smoke, thick and acrid, poured into the canyon, making their eyes water and their lungs burn. They were trapped, two small, insignificant creatures in the face of nature's awesome, indifferent fury. The experience was terrifying, but it was also profoundly intimate. In here, in this small, dark space, with the world burning outside, there was only each other. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, but the fire burned through the night. They were coated in a fine layer of gray ash, their faces streaked with grime and sweat. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the roar of the fire had settled into a steady, distant rumble, they turned to each other. There were no words. There was no need for them. His eyes, in the dim flickering light from the fire outside, were dark with a raw, unguarded emotion. He reached for her, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb stroking her ash-stained cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. This time was different from their desperate coupling in the ruined chapel. This was slow, aching, and deliberate. It was a confirmation of everything that had grown between them in the silence of the canyons. Every touch was a question, every kiss an answer. It was a slow, deliberate shedding of their old skins, of the shame and guilt that had defined them for so long. Here, in the heart of the fire-scorched wilderness, they were reborn, their bodies speaking a language of pure, unadorned need and a tenderness so profound it felt like a kind of grace. It was the slow, aching union of two people who were not just finding solace in each other, but finding themselves. Afterward, they lay wrapped in a single blanket, the smoky air cool on their skin. The fire outside was dying down, leaving behind a blackened, smoldering landscape. Eliza lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. "I'm afraid," she confessed into the darkness, the words she had held inside for so long finally breaking free. "I'm afraid that no matter where we go, no matter how far we run, I'll always be what they called me, that my past will always be a stain that I can't wash out." She thought of the whispers in Pennsylvania, of Agnes's cruel words at the well, of the preacher's pointing finger. "I'm afraid that one day you'll look at me and you'll see it too." Gideon was silent for a long time. His hand moved through her hair, a slow, comforting rhythm. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion that cut straight to her soul. "When I look at you, Eliza," he said, "I see the only person who ever looked at me and didn't see a ghost or a killer. I see a woman who can calm a spooked horse and stitch a wound and face down a bounty hunter in a saloon. I see a woman who was strong enough to ride into this desert with nothing." He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look down at her. "I'm tired of outrunning my past,
It's been chasing me for years. Maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to face it. But to face it beside someone who believes I'm worth saving."
Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a relief so profound it felt like a dam breaking inside her. He was not ashamed of her. He was not ashamed of himself. Not anymore. He was offering her not an escape, but a partnership.
"We could go to Arizona Territory,"
she whispered, the idea a sudden, hopeful spark.
"Find a piece of land, someplace where no one knows our names. We could build something."
He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a genuine smile touch his lips. It transformed his hard face, chasing away the shadows.
"Arizona,"
he repeated, testing the word. "I like the sound of that." For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach in Perdition Flats, a real, tangible hope took root in her heart. They had a destination, a dream. They had each other. They stayed in the cave for another 2 days, letting the land cool and their horses recover. It was a peaceful, stolen time, an eye in the center of the storm of their lives. When they finally rode out, the world was a study in black and gray, the earth scorched and smoking, but here and there, a few stubborn green things were already pushing up through the ash, a testament to life's refusal to be extinguished. They traveled for 2 more days, their spirits lighter, their silence now comfortable and easy. The dream of Arizona was a tangible thing between them, a place on a map that represented a clean slate. They found the watering hole late in the afternoon, a small, rock-lined pool fed by an underground spring, a miracle of life in the arid landscape. They dismounted, letting their horses drink their fill. The sense of peace was absolute. And then Gideon stiffened. His eyes narrowed, fixed on something at the far end of the pool. Eliza followed his gaze. Tethered to a scrubby, half-burned juniper tree, partially hidden in the shadows, was a single horse. It was a powerful bay horse, a familiar horse, Burke's horse. The peaceful silence of the afternoon shattered. The dream of Arizona evaporated like a mirage. He had followed them. He had tracked them through the canyons, through the fire. He was here. And now, somewhere in the rocks above them, he was waiting. The world contracted to the space of a single, indrawn breath. The sight of the horse was a death sentence written in the dust. Before Eliza could even process the thought, Gideon was moving. He was not a man anymore, but pure, coiled instinct. He grabbed her, his hand like a vice on her arm, and shoved her with all his strength toward a massive, sun-bleached boulder that lay at the edge of the watering hole.
"Get down!" he roared, the word a raw, desperate command.
She stumbled, falling hard behind the rock just as the sharp, flat crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon. It was a sound that split the peaceful afternoon in 2, the before and the after. A chip of stone exploded from the boulder beside her head, stinging her cheek with sharp grit. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes searching for Gideon. He was on the ground, a few yards from her, trying to push himself up. His face was a mask of strained, white-lipped agony. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across his side, a blossoming flower of crimson against the dusty brown of his shirt. The shot had come from the rocks above. Burke was up there, hidden, a patient spider in his web. Another shot rang out, kicking up dust near Gideon's head. He collapsed back to the ground, his gun still in its holster, hopelessly out of reach. There was no thought. There was only a primal, terrifying clarity. Eliza lunged from behind the boulder, a frantic, scrambling run. She grabbed Gideon under his arms, her own small frame straining against his dead weight. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her veins, giving her a strength she did not know she possessed.
"Gideon, you have to get up,"
she pleaded, her voice a ragged whisper.
"Please."
He groaned, his eyes glazed with pain, but he managed to find his feet, leaning heavily on her. She was his crutch, the only thing holding him upright. Together, they staggered, a slow, agonizing retreat back toward the mouth of the canyon, away from the open ground of the watering hole. Burke did not fire again. He was enjoying this. He was watching them, letting them believe they might escape. She half dragged, half carried him into a narrow fissure between two towering walls of red rock, a place too tight for a horse to follow and too exposed for a sniper to get a clear shot. She eased him to the ground in the thin strip of shade. His breathing was shallow, a wet, rasping sound that terrified her. The front of her dress was soaked with his blood, slick with a warmth that made her stomach clench. She tore open his shirt. The wound was ugly. The bullet had gone clean through his side, high up, missing anything vital by a miracle of inches. But it was bleeding freely, the entry and exit wounds gaping and raw. He was going to bleed to death right here, in this dusty crack in the earth, if she did not do something. Panic was a high, thin scream in the back of her mind. She forced it down, replaced by a cold, desperate resolve. She remembered the needle and thread in Gideon's own saddlebag, the one he had used on his horse. It was all she had. Leaving him for a moment felt like tearing off her own skin, but she forced herself to do it. She crept back to where their horses stood, still nervously shifting near the water. Burke's horse was gone. He had made his point. He could have finished them both, but he was playing with them. He was a cat, and they were the wounded mice. She grabbed the saddlebag, a canteen of water, and their bedrolls. Back in the fissure, she set to work. Her hands shook so violently she could barely thread the needle. She washed the wounds as best she could with the precious water, her tears mingling with the blood and dust on his skin. He was barely conscious, his head lolling to the side. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Stitching the wound was the hardest thing she had ever done. The needle was thick, meant for tough animal hide, not human flesh. Pushing it through his skin felt like a violation, a fresh act of violence. He cried out once, a low, guttural sound of pure agony, and she nearly stopped. But the sight of his life pouring out into the sand was a greater horror. She kept going, pulling the crude thread tight, creating a clumsy, desperate seam to hold him together. She did the front, then rolled him gently to stitch the back. By the time she was finished, she was shaking from head to toe, covered in his blood, her own exhaustion a leaden weight in her limbs. She bandaged the wounds with more strips of her petticoat and covered him with a blanket. Then there was nothing left to do but wait, and pray to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. For 3 days, the world was a fever dream. The sun beat down on the canyon, turning their small shelter into an oven. Gideon burned with a fever that left his skin fiery to the touch. He thrashed in his delirium, his body slick with sweat, his breathing a constant, labored struggle. Eliza did what she could. She bathed his face with a damp cloth, forced sips of water between his cracked lips, and held him down when the nightmares took him. He was lost in the past, trapped in the smoke and fire of his memories. He muttered names she did not know, issued commands to men who were not there, and in the deepest, hottest hours of the second day, he began to call for his wife. "Sarah," he rasped, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring up at the sliver of blue sky above them. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I should have been there. Forgive me." The name was a knife in Eliza's heart. She had known, of course, that she could never replace the woman he had lost. But to hear him call her name, to see the raw, unabated love and guilt in his fevered eyes, was an agony she had not been prepared for. She was just a ghost tending a ghost. He was looking right at her, but he was seeing someone else. She leaned over him, her own face streaked with dirt and tears. "My name is Eliza," she said, her voice gentle but firm, trying to pull him back from the brink, back from the past, back to her. "I am here. Gideon, it's Eliza." He quieted for a moment, his eyes focusing on her, a glimmer of recognition in their depths. Then the fever would pull him back under, and he would be lost to her again. For 3 days. She did not sleep. She watched him, listened to the rasp of his breath, and feared with every beat of her own tired heart that she would lose him. She was no longer just tending a wound in his side. She was fighting for his very soul, battling the ghosts that were trying to drag him down into the darkness with them. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. She awoke from a brief, shallow doze to find him staring at her. His eyes were clear. The delirium was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. He was weak, his face pale and gaunt beneath his beard. But he was himself. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice a dry croak. Relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over her. "You're awake," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. He tried to sit up, a grimace of pain flashing across his face. "Burke." "He's gone," she said, gently pushing him back down. "For now. You've been sick. A fever." She did not mention his dead wife's name. It was a secret pain she would keep for herself. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the dried blood on her dress, the raw exhaustion etched into every line of her face. He saw the makeshift bandages on his side. He saw the strength that had held him together, that had pulled him back from the edge. "You saved me," he said, the words full of a quiet awe. She managed a small, weary smile. She reached out and took his hand, her small, grimy fingers lacing through his. "You saved me first," she told him gently. "Back there, at the watering hole. You pushed me out of the way. Now, you let me save you." They rested for another 2 days, Gideon slowly regaining his strength. The silence between them was different now. It was filled with a new, profound gravity. They had faced death together, and it had forged a bond between them that was stronger than steel. They made a plan, not with many words, but with a shared, unspoken understanding. They could not stay here. They could not keep running. Burke would find them again. He would not stop until one of them was dead. "He thinks he has us trapped," Gideon said, his voice stronger now. "He'll be watching the trails, waiting for us to make a run for it." "Then we have to do something he won't expect," Eliza said. The old fear, the instinct to run and hide, was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But something else was there now, too, a hard, defiant anger. She would not let Burke destroy the fragile hope she had found with this man. She would not run again. "I'll go back," she said, the words surprising her with their certainty. "I'll go back to Perdition Flats." Gideon stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "No, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Burke could be there." "He won't be," she argued, her voice gaining strength. "He'll be out here, hunting us. He thinks you're dying. He thinks I'm a terrified woman who wouldn't dare show her face in that town again. It's the last thing he'll expect." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "You need medicine, Gideon, real medicine, not just water and prayers. You need bandages, and we need a wagon. We can't travel far or fast enough on horseback with you like this. I can get them." He argued, but he was too weak, and he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. This was not the timid, shamed woman he had met weeks ago. This was a woman forged in the fires of grief and desperation, and her will was as strong as the desert rock around them. The ride back to Perdition Flats was a lonely, terrifying journey. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. But she pushed on, fueled by a desperate, prayer-like focus. When the familiar, ugly scar of the town appeared on the horizon, her stomach tightened into a painful knot. She was voluntarily walking back into her own personal hell. The town's reaction was immediate and brutal. As she rode down the main street on the old mare, a woman emptying a bucket of wash water into the street saw her and spat on the ground at her horse's feet. Men on the saloon porch stopped talking, their faces a mixture of shock and open hostility. She was the murderer's woman, a traitor to the town's fragile sense of order. She went directly to the sheriff's office. Potter was sitting behind his desk, just as she had first seen him, a bottle at his elbow. When he saw her, his fleshy face hardened into a mask of disgust. "What in God's name are you doing back here?" he snarled.
"I need help,"
she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart.
"Gideon Kane is hurt. He needs a doctor."
Potter laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You've got a hell of a nerve. That man is a wanted fugitive, and you're an accomplice. I should lock you up right now." He leaned forward, his small eyes glinting with malice. "Get out of my town. I won't help you. And if I see Kane, I'll shoot him myself." She left his office, the sheriff's hatred a cold weight in her gut. Her last hope was the town doctor, a stooped, elderly man named Miller, whose office was a small, cluttered room at the back of the general store. She had spoken to him only once before, weeks ago, when his young daughter had been sick with a lung fever. Eliza had been in the store buying supplies and had seen the girl's distress, the frantic worry in the old man's eyes. She had given him her own handkerchief, dampened with cool water from the well, and had shown him a way to prop up the girl's head with pillows to ease her breathing. A simple trick she had learned during her own long, secret vigils. It had been a small, impulsive act of kindness. She found Dr. Miller putting away bottles on a shelf. He turned when she entered, and his weary face registered a flicker of surprise, but not the open hostility of the others. She told him everything, her voice low and urgent. She told him about the wound, the fever, the desperate need for medicine. He listened without interrupting, his gaze sharp and assessing. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. "The sheriff has warned everyone against helping you," he said finally, his voice a dry rustle. "They're saying Kane is a dangerous killer."
"He's a good man,"
Eliza said fiercely.
"He's not what they say he is."
The doctor looked at her, and his eyes softened with a flicker of memory. "My Clara is breathing easier these days," he said quietly. "That trick with the pillows, it helped." He sighed. A man caught between his civic duty and his conscience. He made his decision. "Wait here, and stay out of sight." He disappeared into a back room. A few minutes later, he returned with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "Laudanum for the pain," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Carbolic acid to clean the wound. Clean bandages. It's all I can spare." He looked at her, his expression grim. "There's a small buckboard wagon in the alley behind the livery. The axle is cracked, but it will hold for a while if you don't push it too hard. The liveryman owes me for his wife's last illness. I'll tell him you're taking it to settle his debt. Be gone before the sun sets. I can't protect you after that." Tears of gratitude pricked her eyes.
"I don't know how to thank you."
"Just keep him alive," the old doctor said. "That will be thanks enough." She hurried to the alley, her heart soaring with a desperate, fragile hope. The wagon was there, old and rickety, but it was salvation. She hitched the mare to it and was about to lead it out into the street when she saw them, across the way, standing in the harsh afternoon sun in front of the sheriff's office, were Sheriff Potter and Burke. They were talking, their heads close together. The sheriff was pointing out toward the desert, in the direction she had come from. Burke was nodding, a confident, predatory smile on his face. Then the sheriff reached into his office and came back out with a piece of paper. He nailed it to the post outside his door. Even from this distance, Eliza could read the bold, black letters at the top. Wanted, beneath it, a name, Gideon Kane, and below that, a number that made her blood run cold. $500. They had put a bounty on his head. It was no longer a personal vendetta. Now, every greedy man with a gun between here and the territorial line would be hunting him. She saw Burke shake the sheriff's hand and turn, walking toward the livery stable with a purposeful stride. He was coming after them, and this time, he wouldn't be alone. Panic, raw and absolute, seized her. She slapped the reins, and the old mare, startled, lurched forward, pulling the rickety wagon out of the alley and onto the main street. She did not look back. She rode as hard as the old horse and the cracked axle would allow. A single, desperate thought screaming in her mind. She had to get back to the canyon. She had to get back to Gideon. Her heart was a frantic, terrified bird beating against the cage of her ribs, and the setting sun at her back felt like the closing of a trap. The rickety wagon groaned and shuddered over the rock-strewn ground, every jolt a fresh wave of terror in Eliza's heart. She pushed the old mare relentlessly, her eyes fixed on the familiar shapes of the canyons ahead. A prayer caught in her throat. The setting sun cast long, monstrous shadows that seemed to reach for her, claws of darkness trying to drag her back. She was no longer just fleeing a town. She was in a race against death itself. The $500 bounty, a ticking clock that measured the remaining moments of Gideon's life. When she finally reached the fissure where she had left him, night had fallen. A sliver of moon offered a pale, ghostly light. She found him sitting up, his back against the rock wall, his rifle laid across his lap. The sight of him, alert and waiting, sent a fresh wave of relief through her so powerful it almost buckled her knees. "I was beginning to think you'd thought better of it," he said, his voice still weak, but with a new edge of iron in it. "They put a bounty on you," she said, the words spilling out as she scrambled from the wagon. "Burke was with the sheriff. He's coming. He might have men with him." Gideon took in the sight of the wagon, the bundle of medicine, and the grim certainty in her eyes. He had known she would come back. He just hadn't known what new layer of hell she would have to pass through to do it. He pushed himself further upright, a sharp intake of breath betraying the pain in his side. He was recovering, but he was far from whole. His fever was gone, but a deep, unyielding weakness had settled in his bones. He could ride, perhaps, but he couldn't run. Not far and not fast. They both knew it without having to say the words. Running was no longer an option. To be hunted forever. To spend their lives looking over their shoulders, waiting for the inevitable arrival of a man like Burke or the dozen others who would follow him for the bounty. That was not a life. It was a slow, walking death. Their only chance at a future, at the dream of Arizona, was to cut the rot out here, in this canyon. They had to confront Burke. They had to end this. "We can't stay here," Gideon said, his gaze sweeping the narrow fissure. "It's a coffin." "I know," Eliza replied, her mind racing. An idea, born of pure desperation on the ride back, had been taking shape in her mind. It was a wild, fragile thing, a plan woven from her intimate knowledge of her own perceived weakness. Burke saw her as a victim, a terrified woman. She would use that. There's a place a mile back, a narrow pass where the canyon walls pinch together. It's barely wide enough for the wagon. He looked at her, seeing the new hard light in her eyes. He was too weak to fight Burke head-on. He would be a liability in a fair fight. But Eliza was thinking like a survivor. He listened as she laid out her plan, her voice low and steady in the darkness. He did not question her. He did not argue. He simply trusted her. They moved under the cover of darkness. Gideon, leaning heavily on the wagon, drove the mare while Eliza walked ahead, leading the way with a lantern. They reached the narrow pass she had described. It was a perfect bottleneck. On one side, the canyon wall was a sheer, unclimbable cliff face. On the other, a steep, treacherous slope of loose shale and rock. They positioned the wagon sideways, completely blocking the path. Eliza took the old rifle from the saloon, a bag of ammunition, and a canteen of water. She scrambled up the shale slope, finding a small, protected alcove about 20 feet up. It offered a clear view of the path below, a perfect vantage point from which to watch the approach. Gideon unhitched the mare and led her further down the canyon, hiding her in a thicket of mesquite. Then he took his own rifle and found a position for himself, concealed behind a cluster of boulders on the opposite side of the pass, 100 yards beyond the wagon. He was in no shape for a protracted fight, but he could provide a crossfire. He could be a ghost in the rocks. Then they waited. The silence of the desert settled around them. A silence that was not peaceful, but taut and expectant. Eliza sat in her rocky perch, the rifle heavy and alien in her lap. Every nerve in her body was screaming. She was not a fighter. She was not a killer. She was a woman who had spent her life running. But now, she had found something worth fighting for. Something worth planting her feet in the dust and refusing to be moved. She thought of the child she had lost, the family who had cast her out, the town that had condemned her. She had lost everything once. She would not lose it again. Burke arrived just after dawn. He was not alone. He had 2 other men with him, rough-looking riders with greedy, watchful eyes, the kind of men who would kill for a share of $500. They rode at a cautious pace, their rifles held ready. They stopped when they saw the abandoned wagon blocking the path. It was exactly as Eliza had hoped. It was a puzzle they had to solve, a disruption to their hunt.
"What the hell is this?"
one of the men growled. Burke held up a hand, his cold eyes scanning the canyon walls. "It's a trap," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. He dismounted, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. "He's wounded. She's alone. They're trying to spook us." He laughed, a humorless, ugly sound. "The little dove has grown claws." He motioned for his men to spread out. "Jed, you circle around the west rim. See if you can get a high angle. Tom, you come with me. We go in on foot. Find them. Kill the man. Bring the woman to me." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She watched as one of the men spurred his horse back the way they had come, looking for another way up the canyon wall. Burke and the other man, Tom, began to advance on foot, using the rocks for cover. She lifted the rifle. Her hands were sweating. The wooden stock was slick against her cheek. She lined up the sights on the man named Tom, just as Gideon had shown her in a brief, whispered lesson before dawn. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in her small alcove. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of dust a foot to the left of her target, but it had the desired effect. Tom yelled in surprise and dove behind a rock. Burke flattened himself against the canyon wall, his own rifle coming up, firing a blind shot in her direction that ricocheted off the rocks above her head. "She's up there!" Burke yelled. "On the slope! Pin her down!" Tom began firing steadily at her position, the bullets whining past her hiding place, chipping away at the stone. Eliza huddled down, her body trembling, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. This was real. The terror was a living thing in her throat. And then, a second shot rang out, this one from a different direction. It was a deeper, heavier report. The man, Tom, who had been firing at her, cried out and collapsed, clutching a bloody leg. He had been shot from the side. Berkey whirled around, his face a mask of confusion and rage. "Kane!" he roared into the empty canyon. "Show yourself, you coward!" Gideon did not answer. He had made his presence known. The hunters were now the hunted. Burke was caught in a crossfire, trapped between Gideon's deadly accuracy and Eliza's unknown position. What happened next was a chaotic, bloody blur. Burke, realizing his mistake, abandoned his wounded man and began a desperate scramble from rock to rock, trying to get closer to Eliza's position, seeing her as the weaker threat. Gideon fired again, the bullet tearing through the sleeve of Burke's coat, forcing him back behind cover. The third rider, Jed, who had circled around, now appeared on the canyon rim above them. He had a clear shot down at Gideon's hiding place. Eliza saw him take aim. There was no time to think. She stood up from her cover, exposing herself completely, and fired the rifle from her hip, a wild, desperate shot in the man's direction. It was a miracle. The bullet struck the rock face near Jed's head, showering him with stone fragments. He flinched back, startled, his own shot going wide, but now both he and Burke had a clear view of her, It was the opening Gideon had been waiting for. With both men focused on Eliza, he moved from his cover. He was not fast. He was limping heavily, one hand pressed to the fresh, bleeding wound in his side. But he was moving. He fired once, a clean, perfect shot. The man on the rim, Jed, crumpled and fell from sight. Now it was just Burke. He turned and saw Gideon, exposed and wounded. A triumphant, cruel smile spread across his face. He lifted his rifle for the killing shot. But he had forgotten about Eliza. In that split second, she was no longer thinking. She was pure instinct. She scrambled down the shale slope, sliding and stumbling. The old rifle clutched in her hands. Burke heard the noise and turned, his eyes wide with surprise to see her so close. He was a dozen yards away, a clear, impossible-to-miss target. She raised the rifle, the world narrowing to the space between the barrel and the cold, hateful look in his eyes. She saw in his face every man who had ever scorned her, every hand that had ever tried to hold her down. She fired. The shot was true. Burke staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He dropped his rifle, clutching at the red stain that was suddenly blooming on his chest. He took one more step, then fell face down in the dust. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a profound, ringing silence, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She stood there, shaking, the heavy rifle still in her hands, its barrel smoking in the cool morning air. She had done it. She had killed a man, and in doing so, she had saved her own life, and the life of the man she loved. Gideon stumbled toward her, his face pale, his side soaked in fresh blood. He reached her just as the sheriff and 3 deputies rode into the pass, their guns drawn. They stopped dead, taking in the scene of carnage. They saw the 2 dead men. They saw Burke, lying face down in the dust. They saw Gideon bleeding and exhausted, and Eliza, her face streaked with tears and gunpowder, still holding the rifle that had fired the last shot. There were no words. The truth of what had happened was written there in the blood and the dust. It was written on Eliza's face, a testament not to murder, but to a desperate, hard-won survival. Gideon's strength finally gave out. His knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. Eliza dropped the rifle and rushed to him, catching him in her arms, holding him tight as he sagged against her. She was no longer shaking. She was certain. Weeks later, they were granted safe passage. The investigation was short. Burke, it turned out, was wanted in 2 other territories for crimes far worse than bounty hunting. His 2 companions were known outlaws. The story, as told by a tired sheriff who had finally seen the truth, was one of self-defense. The bounty on Gideon was rescinded. They were free. They did not stay. They took the doctor's old wagon, their 2 horses, and what little money the sheriff gave them from Burke's saddlebags, and they headed west, toward Arizona. They found their place months later. It was a small plot of dry, wild land, a place of stark and breathtaking beauty. It was not easy land, but it was theirs. They built a small cabin with their own hands, a sturdy, simple structure overlooking a vast expanse of red mesas that changed color with the passing of the sun. They worked from sunup to sundown, their days filled with the hard, honest labor of building a life. The ghosts of their pasts were still there, but they were quieter now, their whispers lost in the sound of the wind and the slow, steady rhythm of their hearts. One evening, as dusk settled over the land, turning the distant mesas a deep, velvety purple, Eliza stood barefoot on the small wooden porch they had just finished. The air was cool and smelled of dust and sage. She looked out at the vast, peaceful emptiness, and a lifetime of running and hurting and waiting finally came to an end. "I've been waiting so long," she whispered to the twilight, the words a soft release of a breath she had been holding her entire life. She felt his arms wrap around her from behind, his solid warmth a familiar, comforting anchor. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and they stood together, watching the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, And out of the vast, silent land, the desert wind rose to meet them, no longer a sound of desolation, but an answer, soft and low, like a song. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.